Good afternoon, everyone here and folks watching us online. My name is Christopher Allen Bracey, and I'm the Provost and Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs at the George Washington University. As Provost, it's my primary responsibility to ensure that we advance academic excellence at this university. Our students must be trained to become leaders who will solve the world's most urgent problems, and our faculty must push the frontiers of knowledge with the production and dissemination of impactful and excellent research. I firmly believe that we can only reach our full potential as a comprehensive global research university if our aspirations are defined by inclusive excellence. Students, faculty, and staff are all responsible for committing to the work of creating an inclusive and equitable environment where we each feel that we belong and where we have an opportunity and the resources to thrive. We already have a good head start in this regard, given our location in the nation's capital, which makes us home to a vibrant community of scholars and employees hailing from around the world. In our classrooms, research spaces, and our offices, we are exposed to myriad thoughts, experiences, and perspectives, which broaden and deepen our understanding of the world and our community. We must continue to embrace these differences and allow them to make us a stronger academic community. One of the ways that we've been working towards positive change and building a more inclusive environment is through the diversity program review process. And today we are happy to deliver upon our promise to share the results of the climate survey administered to the community in spring of 2022. So let's dive in. Now I want to invite to the podium Carolyn Laguerre-Brown, our Vice Provost for Diversity, Equity, and Community Engagement and Chair of the Diversity Program Review Team. She's going to lead today's discussion. We have an ambitious agenda, so let's get to it. Carolyn?
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. All right, I'd like to start us off, as the provost mentioned, we do have an ambitious agenda. We have a lot to cover in this hour and a half, so we want to start off by just quickly going over the agenda for today's program. We're a research institution, so we will start with a brief overview of our survey methodology. Following that, we will present a series of slides that correspond to the major sections of our GW Climate Survey Executive Summary Report. This report will be available on the Diversity Program Review website, along with the slides from this forum. Our presentation, we will then use the same format to present results for each of the constituent groups that were surveyed. So that would include undergraduate students, graduate students, staff, and faculty. So finally, we will move to the Q&A section at the end of the presentation. There's a QR code on the screen. Feel free as we're going through the presentation to send in questions or jot them down to send in at the end of the presentation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our Associate Vice Provost for Diversity, Equity, and Community Engagement. Oh, I'm sorry, one more slide. I apologize. So quickly, I wanted to recap. In the spring of 2022, our provost appointed faculty, staff, and students to conduct a comprehensive review of the university's diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts to develop a sustainable diversity action plan moving forward. And as the provost indicated, this was an important part of that, the promises that we made when we launched that process. So with that, I will turn it over to our Associate Vice Provost for Diversity, Equity, and Community Engagement.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Jordan Shelby West. I use the pronouns she, her, and hers. Thank you for being here. And what we would like to do is cover some of our goals for this time. But before we get into the list on the screen, we want to say thank you, because several of you in this room, virtually joining us, and throughout our campus participated in the survey that led to this moment. So we want to say thank you for your voice. Thank you for your contribution and your participation. As outlined here on this slide, we are going to spend this time together today to provide high-level summary of the results. And we emphasize high level because there are pages, endless data, tables, et cetera, that tell us what came out of this survey. For those of you who participated, you know there were a significant amount of questions that we asked. And so what you'll learn here are the high level summary of findings. I also want to let those who are in this room, those who are joining virtually know that we will be posting these slides and we will be posting additional tables that provide information that we may not cover in detail here. And we also recognize that some of the tables covered here that we share here will be harder to process in real time. And so those will be posted after our time here together today, in addition to an executive summary about the survey. So all of that will be available on our website the moment we leave here today. The survey is also an important data source to help inform ultimate recommendations provided by the Diversity Program Review Team. As a reminder, this is one component of the provost charge. And I emphasize one component because there are groups that are meeting with some of you in this room, others who are not here today. We have advisory councils. We have a significant amount of people involved in this process, gathering data to inform the final recommendations that will go to the provost and other leadership here at the institution. So the survey was one tool to collect information from the university. And finally, we want to invite you, as Carolyn shared, to submit questions via the website that will be at the bottom of every single screen, but it's also listed up here. It's tinyurl.com/GW Climate Survey. You can submit questions throughout our time here together today. And then for those who are ambitious and want to join us tomorrow, you can submit the questions there too. And so I want to, at this time, welcome members of our survey team who not only assisted us with today's presentation, but also from the beginning, from the onset of developing the survey, they have been integral in this process. So Abby and Aaliyah will join the stage. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aaliyah Miles, and I am a survey research analyst in the Office of Survey Research and Analysis as part of the Academic Planning and Assessment Unit on campus. I'd like to start by talking about the overall survey methodology. I'll be covering basically what went into creating and administering the survey, and also what happened once we had the data. So to start, the survey was developed through an iterative process to find as many questions that would be targeted toward the GW community as possible. We created brand new questions that were generated by the DPRT central team and those in our office in the survey research and analysis team. We also relied on previous GW surveys so that to the best of our ability, we would be able to compare from previous year's surveys. And we also relied on other climate surveys that were used in higher education. All of these questions were edited to be as specific to the GW context as possible. And that was so that we really make sure that these findings are meaningful for us here. So the questions are a mix of quantitative and qualitative questions. The quantitative questions typically look like a 5-point scale of strongly agree to strongly disagree on certain sentiments. And the qualitative questions were targeted, open-ended response options for folks to be able to really dive in and share their experience on things that were happening on campus in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So the survey was administered using a single anonymous link. Maintaining anonymity of the responses was particularly important to us due to the sensitive nature of the content of this survey. And there were incentives for participation because we really wanted to hear from as many people as possible. So it is important to note how the survey reflects the time in which it was administered. So it was administered in mid-April of last year. That comes with it some transition times in terms of leadership and return to campus from the pandemic. We invited students, faculty, and staff to submit their responses up until May 20th was the original cutoff date, but we realized that the response rate that we were looking for had not been achieved yet. And so we added additional incentives and finally closed the survey in early June. It is important to note that the population that completed this survey has likely changed. There are students who have graduated. We have invited new students to come to our campus, and also we have had turnover in terms of faculty and staff, people who are no longer here and people who have been added. And so it's very important to recognize that these findings are one of the only sources of information that we have like this in many years, but again, a snapshot in time. So let's get into the response rates a little bit. I had mentioned earlier that we wanted to have a concerted effort to have as high of a response rate as possible. We found actually that staff had the highest response rate with about 43%. Typically, for surveys like this on our campus and benchmarking across other campuses, we expect between 20 to 30% response rate. So obviously, staff really turned out for this survey. And we attribute that to the fact that staff are sort of undersurveyed in comparison to other populations here at GW. And so we really appreciate that staff came out to provide their feedback here. And we hope that this information data. Obviously, the way we ask the questions is not always the best way to interpret the information. And so some data handling is required. Two ways that we particularly made changes to the data in its raw format are combining similar categories to increase subgroup sample sizes for statistical analysis. So for example, where we had too few people respond to one question, these were mostly for demographic categories, identifying themselves as belonging to one group, where there were so few respondents that it was not possible for us to make any considerable determinations based on that statistical information. We would group those people with similar people. And so I have an example here of the question asking for how long have you been an employee at GW? And so you can see that we had 6 response options originally, and we rolled that up to 3 response options. The process into determining how categories were grouped went into what is similar about people who respond to questions differently and could they be grouped kind of semantically, but also looking at whether the responses across those people are similar within the survey itself. So we found, for example, here that those who responded less than 1 year and 1 to 5 years were responding pretty similarly on the survey. And so it was appropriate to combine them together. The other thing that we did in the process of handling the data is transforming select all that apply questions to one field. The major field where this applied would be job, family, and race and ethnicity categories. And so for this purpose, in order to properly assess the data in terms of the analyses that we were doing, it made more sense to be able to approach these questions as a single select option. But obviously, we wanted to give people the opportunity to share as much about themselves as possible. And so balancing how the data was analyzed in comparison to how it was asked was really important here. I want to get a little bit more into what we mean by data analysis, and I'll be covering the quantitative data, and then I will introduce Abby to talk to us about the qualitative data analysis. So for quantitative, what we mean here is that we were focused on first descriptive statistics. These included frequencies, which are the number of people who responded to something and how that translates to a percentage of the overall sample, and also means or averages. So on a scale from 1 to 5, on average, this group responded a 3.5 out of 5. Additionally, we conducted statistical significance tests to explore demographic differences for each survey question. So as you can imagine, this was a fairly intensive process because we had over 500 fields or specific items. This doesn't translate to 500 questions on the survey, but based on select all that apply questions and questions that have multi-answer or block questions, this was the amount that we were looking at. And we made statistical comparisons between demographic groups to be able to determine what was contributing to someone's experience at GW that directly impacts their identity. That are there pieces of someone's identity or combinations of different identities that really contribute to you having a different experience here at GW than someone in another group. Overall, we synthesized these significant findings based on effect size. So we determined the difference between effect size and statistical significance. Statistical significance tells us that there is a difference that is beyond that due to chance. That on average, you would expect that by chance, there are a certain number of people who differ across these groups. But if the difference is larger than that, then you can say that that is a statistically significant difference. Effect size tells us how big that difference is. With such a large sample size, it's very easy to have many significant findings. And so when we are collating these findings and determining how to share this out and make it more interpretable, we are looking at medium and large effect sizes here. And so that's the difference between, let's say, there is a 10% difference between one group and another group. That could be statistically significant, but maybe not as meaningful as a 30% difference. So now I'll introduce Abby Salvis. They are also a survey research analyst in our office.
Thank you, Aaliyah. Hello, everyone. For the qualitative open-ended responses, there were 10 open-ended questions that each respondent had the opportunity to answer. This resulted in over 10,000 total comments that were then fed back to us for analysis. I used what's called inductive content coding to review these comments in order to synthesize them into something that was a little bit more manageable and could be presented back to you today and through the executive report that will be available later. This inductive content coding means that I read each of these comments and I tagged specific topics or ideas that continued to come up across the comments. After going through all of them by question, I then went back into each topic and looked for themes that emerged within each topic and then across the topics. Those themes and that information was then used, like I said, to add context and depth to the quantitative findings that Aaliyah covered. The only questions that were a little bit different were questions 43 and 44. These questions asked about effective diversity, equity, and inclusion programming here on campus, the offices, departments, and units that are being very successful in this area. So those comments were simply frequency counted. So offices that were mentioned frequently were counted, and then those were presented back in a table form. And then question 44 asked how they were doing it effectively. And again, that one was again, used inductive content coding to reveal those themes for how people are excelling in this area for diversity, equity, and inclusion. I will now pass it back to Carolyn Laguerre-Brown, who will get into our findings. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abby and Aaliyah. We could not have gotten to this point without all of your efforts. Really, really appreciate it. All right, so overall findings. So first, as I said, we're going to go over areas of strength, and then we'll go over areas or opportunities for improvement. Okay, so first area of strength was that a majority of respondents across all constituent groups found a community at GW where they felt they belonged. And the types of factors that fed into this sense of belonging were people articulating that they could identify friends in our community, that there were personal interactions with faculty, that there were opportunities for interest-based student groups, campus-wide events, and other personal interactions with staff. So this was a positive finding. And, you know, you can imagine that for people who work in offices like mine, we are often hearing about things when stuff is not going well here. And so it was encouraging for me to see the respondents respond in this way, in a positive way, about the experiences and sense of belonging over all of the constituent groups. Another area of strength here is that findings suggest that there is a culture of mutual support among GW community members. And the prompt here that fed into this, I feel equipped to advocate for myself in times of need, that I can navigate conflict, that I can support someone when they are in crisis, and I can contact someone when I'm in crisis, right? So those were the factors that fed into that particular finding. Another area of strength across all constituencies, students, faculty, and staff are personally invested in the diversity of the community. So remember, this question is really asking people to respond on that Likert scale to statements like, I'm comfortable with having colleagues from diverse backgrounds in my classes and workplace. And, you know, also that increasing diversity of the GW community is an important goal for GW. So this is not surprising to me, having worked on these issues for a really long time. We often will get people responding in this positive way about diversity generally. And we will sometimes see a disconnect between the things that people actually do in terms of behaviors. But generally speaking, when people are asked in our community if they're supportive of diversity as an ideal, as an agenda, a goal for the university, we see here, you know, that the responses are pretty consistent across the constituent groups. Another area of strength, GW community members highlight exemplary diversity, equity, and inclusion programming on campus in many of their written comments. And that was highlighted, not just in terms of offices like mine, the Office for Diversity, Equity, and Community Engagement, but also in the work of our academic colleges. And we've seen a lot of growth in the development of offices within our schools that are focused on DEI, committees that are focused on DEI. So we saw people kind of calling that out in the survey. They also made mention of diversity-wide events like the Diversity Summit. I would expect that people would remember those. They're a standard feature in our community. So again, that was consistent across all the constituent groups. So now on the overall results, opportunities for improvement. Half of our respondents across the constituent groups have experienced some kind of negative treatment, and community members who have minoritized identities experience it more, and it's specifically targeted toward their identity via different behaviors in different locations and from different people. And if you look at this slide, and certainly as you have time to look at it after today, the overall number was 50%, as I said. But when we pulled out the really statistically significant results here, our transgender and non-binary community, that number was as high as 67%. For LGBTQA plus, that number was at 55%. We also noted that for the groups that are listed here on the slide, including Black African American, 31%, two or more races, 23%, and down the line, you can see that there are, statistically significant instances of people experiencing negative treatment that they attribute to being connected to their identity. So that's a significant finding. That's something that we want to think more deeply about in each of our units. Think about it from the center of the university as well. There are lots of things that I could imagine our 3 subcommittees on the DPRT are going to be thinking about in terms of trying to program and think about policy changes, other things. We want to give that some deep thought about how we want to address that, but that's a significant finding and one that we need to sit with and think through how we're going to respond to that. We also saw across all of the constituent groups, financial and economic issues were a concern across the board, and that it was worse for minoritized communities. I think that this aligns with what we're seeing nationally in terms of increasing wealth gaps in our country. So it's not surprising to me to see this kind of finding. The types of issues that people raised were the cost of tuition, housing, books and other course materials. Food came up. And only a small population, around 25%, have not experienced any financial difficulty at all, right? So this is something that gives us, pause, and I imagine that we may see in the recommendations recommendations that cover this particular issue. So this financial and economic concern, again, was across the board. Other opportunities for improvement. Respondents had relatively low agreement on the adequacy of the university's emphasis on diversity. So we saw varied responses here, and it's hard to parse out what this particular finding means for people, but I think we're going to need to dig deeper in terms of comments to try to understand further what this means. And we're going to talk about some findings later on with the other constituent groups that show us that people have a very different perception of their immediate departments, or say offices like mine that are focused on working on diversity, and their perception of, say, the center of the institution or the university writ large. And so this is a finding that we want to think more deeply about and try to understand, what's under that. In written comments, members of the GW community had a lot of concrete suggestions for improvement of the climate. 60% of the comments suggested improvements to DEI-specific aspects of university climate. And I'll give you just a couple of bullets here: increasing diversity on campus at all levels, students, faculty, staff, and leadership. Let's see, improving leadership support for DEI, and what they noted here, top-down buy-in of DEI efforts, leadership modeling behaviors, university approach to DEI. So they're really just sort of looking to the center to lead the way on this. offering and incentivizing DEI training and programming. That came up a lot in the comments as well. Other suggested improvements, increasing the overall availability of support, whether it's academic, financial, professional, benefits and services, or social. I think certainly post-pandemic, we heard more of this, more need across the community for these kinds of supports. Providing more mechanisms to provide feedback and to be heard in terms of surveys. And so this aligns with what Aaliyah mentioned in her opening comments about the survey methodology, that we heard kind of loud and clear from staff as the group, the constituent group that participated in the highest rates on the survey, that they were hungry to be surveyed, right? And to be asked about their experiences. So this makes sense to me that we would see the number of comments that came through around that topic. All right, undergraduate student findings. Ooh. All right, so areas of strength. Undergraduate students reported that they felt connected to the university, including agreeing that they felt encouraged to be involved in and connected to university life. Some of the things that fed into that undergraduate students feel encouraged to be involved in the university, that they felt that they were supported to provide feedback to the university, they felt connected to university life, and they felt like their opinion mattered to the university, right? And this makes sense to me, and you'll see some differences when we talk about graduate students. When we think about the number of offices and personnel and programming that's directed at undergraduate students, this finding made sense to me, as they have a lot of interaction with the university community. Let's see. The majority of undergraduate students feel supported at the program level and the university level to express their political opinions, right? And so some of the prompts here in the classroom, I feel supported to bring up politically related topics. In my program, I feel I have support to express my political affiliation and views, right? So now we know that, we're reporting to you the major themes, right? And so we have, 58% on that first, graph, and 59%, and then 64%. I recognize that even as I say this, this finding does align with my own experience of GW. My sense is that people here are very comfortable to share their views. We are a robust community where we spend, kind of a lot of time engaging on a whole host of issues. I also know that these numbers tell us that there are a significant number of people who don't feel that way. So we recognize that the fact that this is seen, broadly, or with undergraduate students, doesn't mean that that's everyone's experience. But this was the finding here that came up as a major theme. Sure. Yeah, I don't know. My experience just doing this work is that people tend to not have a sense of how it looks from another person's lens. Now, I could be wrong about that. I'm sure that we could debate that in this room, but I don't always feel that people have a clear sense of how it looks from another vantage point. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. I'm not getting this. Oh, there we go. Just under half of undergraduate students, these are opportunities for improvement, by the way. Just under half of undergraduate students felt uninformed about where and how to report instances of bias, harassment, discrimination, or other negative treatment. So this was a really troubling finding for me, certainly over one of the offices that handles these kinds of concerns. And I will say that it's hard for us to understand what neutral means here in retrospect. It's hard for us to understand what neutral means in this context, right? It could mean that they truly feel uninformed about where to report harassment and discrimination. It could also be that they haven't had an issue and they haven't had to think about it, and so the offices are not coming to mind immediately. So we're kind of thinking through that, and I think that for me, certainly as somebody who leads one of these offices, I want to be thinking really deeply about how do we increase information flow around the different pathways for reporting. How do we make sure that our offices and the processes are on syllabi and in other platforms where students are likely to see it. I know from again, from my vantage point, that people are using all of these processes. So I know that some people do know how to complain, but this finding is something that we can't ignore, and we have to kind of grapple with ways to increase that information flow. But that's the finding there. Over half of respondents indicated experiencing some form of identity-based negative treatment at least once in the last 5 years. And the sources of these experiences were overwhelmingly other students. And again, that aligns with what we're seeing in terms of the complaint processes that we have, whether it's Title IX or other forms of discrimination or harassment. That this finding makes sense. So we pulled out here the groups that had, just significantly higher response rates here, 82% for transgender non-binary folks, and 73% for LGBTQA plus folks. And then we also have on the bottom the overall number for students, and then a breakdown by faculty, staff, and students. So faculty are around 27%, for example. Staff were around 12%. Let's see, the others, there was smaller in number, but these findings tell us that we really want to be thinking really carefully, especially in these places where we see transgender, non-binary, and LGBTQIA+, that we're seeing this difference. It tells us that we really need to be thinking about ways to address some of these concerns, increase the education and training that could prevent potentially some of these concerns. So for graduate student finding, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jordan.
So as we shift into graduate student findings, what we recognize is that many members of our community hold both graduate identities and staff and/or faculty identities. And so you'll still find that some of the data is specific here to graduate students, and then you'll see some connections as we move into staff and faculty. So to start, we recognize through this survey that an area of strength is that graduate students have positive perceptions of the climate, specifically within their programs. And so in another slide, we'll talk about the university, but focusing here on their academic programs, what you'll notice is an 80% response rate of positivity around agree or strongly agree that graduate students are feeling support from their faculty. The other categories listed here, and then the majority being positive, are access to professional development, access to mentors, a sense of belonging, and access to participate in research. And what we continue to name and want to make sure is emphasized throughout not only this process here today, but as you engage in the slides and executive summary, is that this is based on those who responded. So what we find to be important is that this is based on those, again, who responded to the survey. The next slide shares another area of strength that came through on the survey, where graduate students are overwhelmingly committed to staying at GW, with only 6% of respondents indicating either plans to leave or serious considerations of leaving. So the majority of graduate students who participated in the survey indicated that they want to stay, they want to be here, they're committed to staying. Those who indicated potentially thinking about leaving or having thought about leaving shared that these are the top 3 reasons: to attend a more affordable institution, so costs; to attend an institution with a stronger academic reputation; to discontinue studies and pursue another opportunity, such as a job or something else that they do outside of the academy or outside of being a student. And so again, the majority said that they would like to stay, they want to stay, they're interested and committed to staying. Another area of strength is that graduate students feel supported to engage in critical thinking and to ask questions in their classes. So the prompt here is, in the classroom, I feel supported too. And you'll notice here that we have pretty high percentage rates in terms of positive, with our highest being 89% said that they feel that they're supported to engage in critical thinking. And then with the lowest percentage rate in positive as 79% around using creativity. And so graduate students conveyed to us through the survey that they feel that they're supported to engage in particular ways that I think institutions of higher education are hopeful about when it comes to not only student learning, but also graduate student learning overall. An area for improvement as it relates to graduate students. So graduate students feel more connected and supported in their department or program. However, they do not feel as connected or supported by the university. And for those of you who may hold graduate student identities and or work with graduate students or identify as a member of the graduate community, you might understand that this is something that could resonate with you. So what we acknowledge here is that in the percentage breakdown, we have 80% of students saying, in my program, I feel I have support from my faculty. Then if you go towards the bottom, we have 49% saying, I feel encouraged to be involved in the university. So under 50% are saying that they feel encouraged to be involved in the university. And 31% said they feel connected to the university, with the majority then in turn feeling disconnected from the university. Another area of opportunity for graduate students, around a third of graduate students experienced identity-based negative treatment. And so on all the categories of community members here at GW, we'll talk about identity-based treatment and experiences. Here, what you'll notice, similar to what Carolyn highlighted for undergraduate students, is that we have a significant amount of students who are indicating that based on gender, sexuality, and/or race, they have experienced negative treatment. And in many cases, they're saying, I've experienced it across multiple aspects of identity. So this is just at a minimum, one aspect of identity was what they believe the cause, the target of their negative treatment. So while the number here in terms of overall graduate student experience around negative treatment was 39%, which is again under 50%, it's still concerning, particularly when you break down where they're experiencing this negative treatment, with 69% related to gender identity. So because of their transgender identity or gender nonconforming identity. Another area of improvement for graduate students were more uncomfortable expressing their political opinions on campus and in the classroom as compared to undergraduate students. So you might remember Carolyn just shared a statistic, a fact that came through here around undergraduate students being politically active and charged and feeling supported. Here, what we see with graduate students is a slight shift. So while it's 50% to some extent, it's about through the middle in different categories. What's important to emphasize here is that we have more graduate students compared to undergraduate students talking about feeling uncomfortable to express in the same ways that we heard Carolyn share around undergraduate students. So the two bottom ones specifically say, in my program, I feel I have the support to express my political affiliation and/or views. And you'll notice that there was a critical amount of students who said, no, disagree. The other point here is, in my program, I feel I have a sense of belonging. And for those of you, particularly those in the room who are engaged in student life and student engagement, you will understand sense of belonging is a concerning factor if people say that they do not feel a sense of belonging. That could relate to a sense of community, that could relate to connection, and in this case, related to sharing their political ideology or perspective. Shifting now to staff findings, which probably connects to several of you joining us online and in this space. To remind folks too of what Abby and Aaliyah shared, staff had the highest response rate across members of the community here at GW. So an area of strength. In their departments or units, staff feel respected, trusted, and encouraged to share ideas and to participate in decision making. And so there's a significant amount of points here that share where we see the positive, meaning where we have noticed staff are saying, I feel positive, I feel good, I agree, or I strongly agree. With the highest one being respected by my colleagues at 84% in terms of response rate, and then at 72%, given time to get work done at 72%. So what you'll notice here, and what you'll be able to process more when you digest the slides, is that a significant amount here are still at agree. And we would love people to be at strongly agree. And so there's always an area of opportunity, even when we're doing well in maybe a certain area. The other thing I'll reiterate here is that we recognize this is those who responded, and that those who didn't may have different perspectives and feelings that we still want to acknowledge throughout this process of the review. Another area that we want to highlight for staff is around improvement. Staff who have minoritized identities experienced identity-based negative treatment more than others. So amongst staff, those who have minoritized identities experience identity-based negative treatment more than others. So what we want to emphasize here is similar to what we noticed with graduate and undergraduate students. So overall, there was a response rate of 47% who said that they experienced a negative treatment as it relates to identity. However, what you'll notice that the percentage increase is above 50% when we focus on gender identity and sexuality. Again, with transgender and non-binary, at 61% respondents saying they experienced a negative treatment based on gender and or sexuality. And then you'll notice on this slide a similar breakdown around race and ethnic identities that were captured here in the survey. And an area for improvement that comes forward, and this is pulled out from some of our qualitative components of the survey, in written comments, staff have concrete suggestions for improving the climate. So I'll read some of these. 52% of comments suggested improvements to DEI specific aspects of the climate. So one of the things that came through in a significant amount of comments was leadership's support for DEI. So perceptions of it or perceptions that it doesn't exist. And so several comments spanned a spectrum around perceptions of leadership's commitment to DEI. And similar to what Carolyn and others shared before, what we know is the term leadership can also be perceived as broad. So in a written comment, somebody saying leadership could be department specific, it could be university wide specific. And so pulling apart where leadership is coming forward, offering and incentivizing DEI training and programming, increasing diversity at all levels, and improving inclusion on campus. And so similar to other data points that Carolyn read before, the idea and the comments about increasing diversity, the visibility of diversity, the knowledge of diversity is coming forward as a recommendation. Suggested improvements to policies and practices. So separate from just broad recommendations, specific here from staff around policies and practices, increasing salary and benefits. Understood. Providing more mechanisms to provide feedback to be heard. This is really important here. I think it connects to what Carolyn shared around reporting broadly for undergraduate students, but for staff here, knowing where to report, but also what we read through the qualitative comments was where can I tell people just what's going on in general? Where do I give my feedback? How do I give my feedback up? Oftentimes I can give my feedback down in terms of org structure, but where do I provide feedback to leaders, to the institution, beyond these one-time formal opportunities, maybe around different parts of the year? And then finally, making changes to HR policies, filling vacancies, telework, flexible schedules. And what we acknowledge even in this example is that while it came through a lot in the qualitative feedback, is that many of our campus partners are already working on some of these areas. And we hope that we'll be able to not only share that throughout the diversity program review process, but it's important to name that here, that I know our colleagues in HR have already engaged with several members of the leadership team to determine some of the ways in which HR policies can be shifted or have already been shifted to reflect some of the feedback we've already heard. And with that, I will pass it back to Vice Provost LaGuerre Brown.
All right, faculty findings. All right, so areas of strength here. In their departments and units, faculty feel trusted, respected, and given opportunity to participate in decision-making to a high degree. And some of the prompts here where we saw either agree or strongly agree that they felt trusted to make decisions within the scope of their work, that they were respected by their supervisors, that they were respected by their colleagues, that they were trusted in a more broad sense, and that they were encouraged to share ideas, right? So this was, again, broad responses, and you'll see here on the slide, just really high percentages of that agree and strongly agree. Most faculty indicated that they directly support students in and outside of the classroom through diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. So this was these were higher numbers than I would have expected to see here. And some of the prompts here where faculty answered agree and strongly agree. I actively change my pedagogy to be more inclusive and address the needs of a diverse student body. I actively change my pedagogy to include diversity, equity, and inclusion related to my field. I feel equipped to connect diversity, equity, and inclusion to my course content, and so on and so forth. So you see faculty answering to a really high degree on this question. What I will say about this is that in some ways, when I looked at this slide initially, when I looked at this data initially, it aligned with what I was seeing in our offices. So we have had, particularly post pandemic, and actually post the 2020, our office has been kind of inundated with requests from faculty all over the campus community to support them in trying to make their classroom experiences more inclusive, right? So reaching out to us for inclusive classroom design. We did trainings at the law school. I mean, just a number of requests from all across the university. I know that the faculty development office within GW Libraries hired a person who's focused on doing this kind of work. And that office has also received a tremendous number of requests from our faculty to work on building inclusive classroom spaces. What we also know from this survey is that in looking at other answers to the similar questions from students, like the student perspective of this, that there appeared to be a disconnect, right? That we didn't see students respond as positively around some of these same questions. The other end of these questions, they were less likely to respond in as positive a way as our faculty saw it, right? And that tells us that I know that we're getting a lot of requests, but we're not getting requests from all the faculty who are here, right? So maybe students across the board are not seeing this kind of interest in making the changes that would make classroom experiences more inclusive. We also saw that underrepresented minority students, trans students, non-binary, that they were also less likely to say that they felt that their experiences were incorporated into the curriculum, into their classroom experiences. So opportunities for improvement. There were significant differences in faculty experiences based on race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, and job status. And so what we saw here is similar to the findings around negative treatment that we've seen with all of our constituent groups. Underrepresented folks were more likely to result that they had experienced negative treatment. They were also more likely to have a perception that they had less opportunity than, say, their colleagues did, right? So we saw when comparing full-time faculty versus part-time faculty were less likely to experience or to perceive that they had access to opportunities. Also, when we compared tenure track versus non-tenure track faculty, we also saw a similar tendency of that non-tenure track faculty to have more negative experiences and to also have less of a sense that they had access to opportunity. Opportunities for improvement. In written comments, faculty had concrete suggestions for how to improve the climate. And what we saw here was 61% of the comments suggested improvements to DEI-specific aspects of university climate, improving diversity at all levels, access to DEI training and programming, leadership support for DEI. Other suggested improvements: equitable access to resources and increasing salary and benefits, especially for adjunct faculty members, providing more mechanisms to provide feedback and to be heard in the way of surveys and other evaluations, and increasing actual change or action when responding to incidents and accountability of leadership more broadly. So those were the types of comments that were coming through as major themes in the comments. So we've now reached the end of the formal presentation of the data. And as I said, and as others have said, that the PowerPoint slides and additional supplemental slides that we did not cover here will be available as soon as this forum is over, as will the full report. The full executive summary report will also be available online. So at this time, we're going to open up the Q&A, and I'd like to have my colleagues just come up to the stage. Dr. Jordan West, I'm sorry. Oh, submit your questions through the link. Thank you. The tiny URL or the QR code.
Thank you to our team who's been here for tech and CART and live streaming. I just want to appreciate all of you for your assistance with this entire day and tomorrow. So we're going to begin with some of the questions that have already come in. There's a variety of questions I'm watching literally filter in right now. So we will try to answer as many as possible. I'll also try to do my best to direct it to particular people who might have a response in that area, but I also welcome all panelists to respond. Please just make sure your microphone is on when you're talking. So we'll start with some questions about the data itself. So there was one question that came in about the presentation. Will the recording be available? I'll just reiterate for everyone that this recording will be available. So the live streaming has also been recorded. It will be on our Diversity Program Review Team website, which can be found through the initiatives page on the Provost website. So these slides, the executive summary, and the recording will be available. I will just note that the recording may take a minute to process and upload, so the other content will be there right away. The recording will be available. So first question, so this might go specifically to Abby and Aaliyah. Will disaggregated data be made available to colleges and the student services teams at different colleges? And I'll actually broaden the question a little bit to say, how could people access data that may not be available right on the website?
So, in working with the diversity program review team more broadly, which each has constituency groups attached to them for students, faculty, and staff, we have provided more targeted data reports for each of them. We've also reached out to the deans in each college and provided the data for their school, still anonymized, obviously, and where there are not enough respondents, we have not provided that information. And that is also broken out by undergraduate, graduate students, staff, and faculty. In terms of on the staff side, we are also in the process of developing those same reports for vice presidents of the university and other units, which had enough people respond to the survey to maintain anonymity.
I would just add that we take really seriously the promise of anonymity here. We recognize that we asked people to identify themselves in a variety of ways on this survey. We recognize how sensitive some of this data is, particularly if you are small in number in a particular department. So we are very cognizant of the importance of making sure that we don't make anyone sorry for participating in this survey process.
Great, thank you. So one question that came in specifically around faculty, and so I'll ask the provost and Carolyn to respond maybe initially. I'm going to read the question also as it was written. Somebody said that they were shocked by the faculty responses related to changing pedagogy to incorporate diversity, equity, inclusion content. I'm wondering your thoughts on whether non-respondents might answer differently or whether there are different avenues for collecting targeted information from both students and faculty on this issue. For example, is it possible to ask what exactly were the changes faculty made to their courses?
So I'm not sure we could go back to the actual respondents of this survey to follow up and get that data. But I think we certainly could give more thought to trying to understand how faculty across the university have been making changes to their curriculum to make it more inclusive. And this is certainly something that I think, given this finding, you might see emerge from a set of recommendations coming out of the diversity program review process. So we're, for us, this survey is really meant to inform the recommendations that will come. And I could imagine seeing a recommendation that touches on this particular issue and trying to get at that information. I'd also say that, again, the survey results really reflect the group of people who chose to participate in the survey, right? And so, for somebody who may not think that diversity and inclusion in the classroom is important, they're less likely to have participated in the survey to begin with. So I think that we have to kind of contextualize the responses that we're analyzing and in the context of the snapshot that it represents.
And I would just add that, someone who has modified their own curriculum to advance diversity interest, I can give you some concrete examples of how I did it as a law professor. One was selecting cases in courses that were not diversity courses, right? I was teaching civil procedure, for instance, but there are a variety of cases to make a point in a class about a principle of law. But I was very strategic in using cases that involved diverse defendants and plaintiffs, or circumstances that evoked civil rights, or other aspects that signal a degree of inclusion within the curriculum. The other thing that some faculty members do is when they write their examination questions, they would provide scenarios or factual background context that involve scenarios that are frequently, or at least familiar with diverse students. And so that's something that I did as a law professor. And this was before, the diversity. It was just my effort to provide accessibility to the material to students who I know were coming from diverse perspectives.
Thank you. And this probably stays on you, Provost Bracy and Carolyn. With so many faculty of color, specifically Black faculty cited here, experiencing various incidents, potentially negative, what are we doing to make sure that we retain Black faculty and other faculty who may have these experiences at GW?
I think first and foremost, we want to make sure that to the extent that something comes to us, that we're responding to that and that we're providing the support. We have a lot of mechanisms available, but I think that there are a lot of reasons why faculty may not want to engage the processes that we have. I mean, we see reluctance across different communities to engage in formal process, and I can imagine with a faculty member in a department being reluctant to utilize formal process. But I think that's on us to try to continue to think about additional ways to train, to support, to communicate, so that people know that we are available and we're willing to support them through process should they need it. So I think that is going to be really important moving forward.
I would also add that, like many of our faculty, our minority faculty are incredibly talented and highly coveted. And so it is just a fact of life that when you're successful as a young academic, and you get the support of your home institution, whether it's your department or your school, as you move up the ranks and you're successful in your research and teaching, you become attractive to other institutions. And that's one thing that keeps me up at night more than anything else, is knowing that we have a number of successful young faculty members who I know will move on to better institutions than GW because they have new opportunities. And we do everything we can to try to retain them. But there's certain levers that as provost or as a dean or as a department chair, you can't overcome. We routinely lose faculty to competitor programs that are more endowed in terms of professorships or have more resources than us. And that's a fact of life. And we know that it's going to happen. But from my perspective, creating an environment where faculty feel they can thrive here at GW is the most important thing we can be doing as an institution. And I do what I can from my perspective or perch as provost, but I also encourage deans and department chairs to do the very same thing, to provide people with a deepened sense of community and belonging so that they'll want to be here and not find those other opportunities that will come down the line as attractive.
One more thing is that I'm thinking about the recommendations that will come from our DPRT. I really hope to see a recommendation that calls out the need to support our department chairs in trying to take a more active role to shape climate and culture in the departments, because we know from analyzing this data, we know from some of the discussions that we've already had within the DPRT that when people are asked about how they experience GW in terms of DEI, when they answer that question, they're talking about their day-to-day lived experiences in their departments. If you're a faculty member, that's what when you answer that question, you're answering, how am I experiencing my day-to-day with my supervisor, with my colleagues at department meetings? And I really want to encourage us to not think of departmental climate as something that happens to us, but something that we can actively shape. And I think that for me, my goal will be to try to think through when I absorb these data and think them through. I want to think about ways that we can better support the chairs that we have to again take that active role in shaping climate.
Some questions that came in specific to survey design and structure that Aaliyah and Abby might be best to answer. Is the faculty data broken out by rank?
Yes. So we looked at both part-time, full-time status, rank, and tenure status. There were some difficulties in terms of understanding. From my perspective, I'm not a full faculty member here. I've taught a class, but so I don't fully understand necessarily the different terminology that's used. And so there were a number of faculty who were adjunct, and adjunct was not a term that we actually used. So we assumed the people who were part-time would be kind of there and who were not tenure track, that would kind of fall under adjunct. So kind of working with those together, we saw a number of differences that were brought out in the presentation earlier today, and more specific ones that have been made available to the diversity program review team. But we did look at all three of those variables.
One of the questions too around data from whom were staff primarily experiencing identity-based negative treatment? So if you remember in the slides, we talked about staff and different communities experiencing identity-based negative treatment. So who were staff experiencing the treatment from?
Yeah. So 60% of those staff who responded that they had experienced negative treatment said that negative treatment came from other staff members. And then to address the other part of the question, only 9% said that it came from students.
And then from a semantics end around the survey, there's a question about what was conveyed. There was a category that said general negative treatment versus at least one form of identity-based treatment. So just specifying or clarifying the language.
I can provide a little more context to the way that we asked that question. The overall question was, I have experienced negative treatment due to, and the response options were a list of identities, in addition to one response option that said, I have experienced negative treatment, but I don't attribute it to my identity, and I have not experienced negative treatment. And so, in calculating what you see in the graphs there, we pulled together people who had experienced negative treatment due to any one or more of the identities that we listed out, and added that also to people who said that they had experienced negative treatment but did not associate that with their identity.
Thank you. Another question, I think, for you all. Are students who disagree with the university making an effort toward diversity, perhaps more or less of minority groups? Was this looked into?
Yeah, so all of those questions were compared across demographic variables, specifically race, ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation. And for, I believe, the items that person is referring to are the emphasis on diversity questions. And for all of those, there were statistically significant differences, such that our minoritized students were most likely to disagree with those statements. So again, those would be racial minorities, LGBTQA plus students, and trans and non-binary students were most likely to disagree that the university has a sufficient emphasis on having diverse students, staff, faculty, and administration.
I will also add to that that it is a little difficult to disentangle the quantitative results there, specifically because um, folks have different access points to different people on campus. So, me as a student, I have access to maybe the 5 faculty in my department, maybe some in other departments that I have taken a course from, but I don't get to see the full diversity of every one of those groups in my day to day. And so, we also looked toward the qualitative responses than open-ended responses. And most of that is really coming from the people are saying, I'm not seeing it in whatever I'm participating in. I'm not seeing people who look like me. And we think that might be driving what is in the quantitative results there.
This question is likely for the provost. So, the person here asks or notices that graduate students had far more interaction with faculty, or at least that was pulled forward as a positive theme and experience. What can be done to expand these relationships for undergraduate students?
Yeah, well, so part of I think the artifact of data there with graduate students is that, you know, graduate students are basically recruited at the school and department level, and their life is centered much more closely around their schools and departments. So it's inevitable that they have a deeper bond with their faculty that are directly supervising their work, providing close instruction in smaller classroom settings. So it's sort of expected to see that there. On the undergraduate side, as you know, recruitment of undergraduate students is handled centrally. Those students are then funneled into particular schools, but a large chunk of them reside in the Columbian College. They're going to have less direct contact with faculty members because many of them are going to be enrolled, at least in their first few years, in large introductory courses. So that may be skewing the data a little bit there. One thing that we've been working on for the past year or so is increasing the number of courses that are offered with an enrollment below 20. And we did that very intentionally because we wanted to balance out some of those large course experiences that students were having with the smaller, deeper, more pedagogically nuanced classroom settings with fewer students and allow for that deeper contact with faculty members. There's a balance that needs to be struck there. You know, when you have more classes that are taught with 20 students or less, well, 19 students or fewer, that means you need to hire more instructors. And that becomes a challenge for us, but we do what we can to make sure that we have those small sections, that they're taught by high quality instructors, and that we're not decreasing the quality of the learning environment by putting instructors in the classroom who really aren't capable of performing at the GW level.
So building off of that, Carolyn, you may be best to answer this one. How might we account for the differences between the results we heard from undergraduate and graduate findings? For example, connection to the university. What can we do to further build a positive connection for graduate students to the institution?
I think I alluded to this earlier, that I think that we know that so much of our university resources and personnel are formally focused on working on issues regarding undergraduate students. So it wasn't surprising to me again to see a finding that they had more of a sense of connection to the university writ large than say, our graduate students. Um, but I think there are things that we can do, and part of that, and some of the things that I'm thinking about, and I imagine that the subcommittees are thinking about as well, is trying to increase the number of communications and the number of programs that we do. I know that in our office, in our Multicultural Student Services Center and in our central office, we've actually started to hire students that are focused on programming for graduate students. In the past, most of our programming has been focused on undergrads, and we started to recognize, and graduate students would come into the MSSC, or they would seek to do work with the Office for Diversity, Equity, and Community Engagement, and they would, comment to us that there wasn't enough programming for that directed at them. So we now have a graduate program assistant in our office who's been hosting events and opportunities, social gatherings, and other opportunities for graduate students. I think we're going to need to do that across a number of offices to try to see if we can get at this experience that our graduate students are having.
I would add one more thing to that, which is when I became provost, I noticed that we had a particular blind spot when it came to the graduate student experience. We had spent a lot of energy, as Carolyn suggested, focusing on the undergraduate student experience, and we had expended zero effort in enhancing and even analyzing the graduate student experience. So, one of the things that I did was hire a vice provost for graduate affairs. And that person is now tasked with thinking intentionally about how to enhance the graduate student experience. And he's already begun to put into place certain measures that I think will help graduate students feel a deeper sense of belonging at this university. There is a graduate student newsletter that is being circulated. He has begun to develop a graduate student council, sort of like a student association just for graduate students. He has introduced many of our graduate students to our postdoc students to sort of deepen the understanding of the contribution that graduate students and postdoc students, the contribution they make to the research enterprise at the university. And I believe in just a few weeks, he'll be hosting an open reception for our graduate students. I think in this ballroom
Mhm.
or maybe the one next door, because we have a lot of graduate students. Many people don't know that we actually have more graduate students than we have undergraduate students at the George Washington University. So I think we're making baby steps in that direction, but I think we've at least made the commitment to think very carefully about how to improve our graduate student experience for all of our graduate students, including our minority students.
Thank you. Throughout the questions, there's a few themes that are coming up, and so I'll combine them into maybe one question. There's folks who are noticing that there were identities that weren't discussed. For example, religion, or specifically around cisgender identities, or any other aspect of identity that wasn't highlighted on the slides. Abby, Aaliyah, could you just speak a little bit about the intention behind what came out on the slides, and then also where this data does exist as folks are asking questions about particular demographic components?
Start. So as far as our intentionality about which identity groups were called out, those were specifically ones that stuck out to us as the people working with the data. Also, to back up a little bit, as Aaliyah mentioned earlier, we had a lot of really serious conversations around how we were going to combine these identity groups. A lot of what you see as far as the groups that were compared and presented to you today is not how those questions were asked. So we had a lot of really important and very thoughtful conversations within our team as a research and analysis team, as well as with Dr. West and with Carolyn to make sure that we were approaching this in the correct way. Um, as far as the groups that we presented today, those were, again, the ones that stuck out to us the most. As far as cisgender identities, I know that we only saw transgender and non-binary up there today. All of those gender analyses were across men, women, and then transgender and non-binary folks. And usually, not universally, the way those results came out were that it was the worst for transgender and non-binary folks, and then it was not so good for women, and then men had the best off. Obviously, there are many different ways that you can split up those identities, many different ways that you can look at that, but that was the way that we chose to go about it, and Aaliyah can speak more to that as well, and how we wanted to call it out to really present kind of the hierarchies of vulnerability within our university community.
I can follow up on some of the other things that we measured that weren't presented here today. So specifically called out were religious affiliation and political views or political affiliation. We did ask about those questions. We did review the statistical comparison results for those questions, and there were significant differences in some places. Those have been presented to the diversity program review team, but again, in essence of maintaining anonymity, we focused on some broader categories here today. And these also were the ones that were showing kind of the most consistent results of people experiencing more of a consistent positive or negative experience. In some of the other places, it was more specific depending on what question we were asking. And so, again, we were focused on high level results today. But the diversity program review team has access to tables and statistical analysis results for all of the questions across many different demographic categories. I just also want to follow up that some of the information we covered today is high level, but we do go into more identities in the document that will be provided today after the presentation.
Thank you. So there's a question that just came in, and I'll answer it briefly. Somebody, in response to the discussion on graduate students, asked about instituting a coffee hour. We actually have that. So we have a program through the Office for Diversity, Equity, and Community Engagement called Grad Connect. We actually bring people together every single month to engage in this exact way. There's also a variety of other programmatic things that come out of our graduate programming efforts. And so I invite folks to follow us on Inclusion at GW, which is our Instagram, and your academic colleges and university leadership council members all get an email about once a month with this programmatic information. But I'm happy to respond directly to folks. If you have questions, you're welcome to email me. But we do have this in motion. And I think that obviously academic colleges could consider opportunities within the college too. Provost Bracy, a question that's coming out that I think has popped up in a few ways are around the expectations set to university leaders around what to do with this data now, knowing again that this is just one part of the entire review process.
No, that's a great question. When we began this process, when I was first talking about it with Carolyn, I said, what we really need are concrete recommendations that come from people that are informed by not only data, but also the literature that's out there and best practices that are known. Because, from my perspective, it's important to make material gains on this issue. And I wanted to make sure that what we did was not engage in just sort of a theoretical exercise, but really drill down on the concrete things that will change people's lives in material ways on campus. And so my expectation is that all of our campus leaders will have an opportunity to review this data, review the summary report that's out there, and that they'll reflect on what's possible within their department or within their unit, and they will have a conversation about that with their colleagues and ultimately bring to me a set of recommendations that are actionable, and that have measurable outcomes. And I'd love to be able to put in the structures that allow for those sorts of activities to take place, and then go back and check to see if we're making progress against the benchmark. That's what I hope comes out of this process, among other things, Jordan.
Mhm. Thank you. And another question is about the information that will be shared, knowing that we have a presidential transition underway. The person is asking if the incoming president, the president elect, will be brought up to date and how that information will be conveyed in transition.
Absolutely. I already have a regular meeting cadence with the president elect, and I've been doing that for a little over a month now. And, we are working through all of the big ticket items. And the big ticket items are the ones that keep the president or the provost up at night. But they also include these sort of initiatives that I've begun at various points in my tenure as provost. And obviously, this diversity program review is one of the more significant ones that we announced fairly early on when I was named interim provost. And it represents a great deal of effort that's been undertaken by members of our community to better understand who we are as an institution, so that we can improve who we are as an institution. And I framed it that way with Dr. Granberg when I spoke to her about this particular project. And I explained to her also my expectations that we would put in the work once we get those recommendations. And if you haven't met Dr. Granberg yet, I think that you will find that she is a strong supporter of inclusive excellence. She understands that diversity is an institutional value that we hold very dearly here at this institution, and that we expect that others who join this institution also care very deeply about diversity and understand what our commitment to inclusive excellence means. So I think that, Dr. Granberg has a lot to acquire by way of knowledge about our very complex university. And there are a lot of issues that we're going to be discussing going forward, but you can count on the fact that the results of this diversity program review effort and the recommendations that come out of it are going to be on the list of things to do.
Thank you. Carolyn, this might be best for you. Could you articulate what you might notice or have read through the survey results and maybe just your experience in general? Maybe addressing the disconnect that exists, at least verbatim, around faculty's perceptions that they are engaging in a lot of pedagogy and updates and inclusive practices around DEI, and students potentially saying that they're not, whether that was through the survey or things that we read in the Hatchet or other avenues. So maybe just speaking to that potential disconnect, what that could be.
Like I said earlier, I think that, you know, I think when I talk to faculty across this institution, and one of the reasons why I have continued to enjoy being a member of this community is that people are generally supportive of diversity and inclusion in terms of, an agenda as an overall goal for the institution. But I think people do struggle with operationalizing their commitment to diversity and inclusion in their day-to-day practice, right? It's easier to think about it as a broad, lofty concept. It's much harder to actually make the changes that we need to make. And on the flip side, when I think about even when I joined the institution in 2016, I was presented with climate survey data that had been taken in 2015. So this was pre the first Trump election. Imagine just the difference in tone and tenor in the country and certainly in DC at that time. And I was just kind of amazed by how positive the data was across. And this was a survey that was focused on students. The one area of the survey that was, lower than I would have expected to see, given how positive it was this question of whether or not diversity was included in curriculum. There was a stark difference between, for example, Black and white students on this question. So this is something that we've, that we've struggled with as an institution, and where, we've worked really hard, in our office to provide support and services for faculty who want to make the changes. But we know that we're not seeing the changes being made across the board. So I'm not surprised by the disconnect, and I think we hear the disconnect in bias incident reports. We hear the disconnect in other types of complaints that students are making to their department about some experiences that they're having in class. So, I myself have a daughter who is a junior here, and I was encouraged to hear her tell me in class after class that students were talking, I mean, the faculty were talking about Black Lives Matter. Like, she started in 2020, right? So she started at a time that was very charged in the country, and I was encouraged at the extent to which it was included in her. But I recognize that that's not the experience for all of our students across a bunch of different disciplines, and I think that disconnect is an area for opportunity that that I think the diversity program review team, I'm sure, is going to be recommendations.
Provost Bracy and Carolyn, you both can probably speak to this in different ways. There was a lot of data points that came out through the survey, knowing that Aaliyah and Abby noted at the beginning too the timing. So this was almost a year ago when people actually filled it out. And Provost Bracy, you were also newly into the role. Could you speak to anything that came out in the survey that you believe we are already either addressing, have addressed, or are working to address? You started to mention some of the things that keep you up at night that you're working on around even graduate student pieces. We mentioned earlier things around the work designation. Could you just pull forward maybe some items that you want to make sure folks know are already underway and folks are asking, like, have we done things yet? What's being done?
So I'd certainly say the work that I've mentioned earlier about just inclusive classrooms and the work that we do in a number of different schools to address, those issues. The work from home or remote work. Imagine at the time that we had that survey out,
Mhm.
the university had yet to release policy or a work designation process. So at the time that that survey was released, there was a lot of angst in the community about where the university would topics. I imagine that that was something that was very real for people as they answered. I'd also just add that I know from my conversations with the head of our HR, Sabrina Miner, that there are plans underway to create greater opportunities for staff to be organized with each other, provide feedback to the university about their experiences, and I know that there is an announcement coming about efforts to create that kind of space for staff. I don't know if there are other things that you want.
Yeah, I'd mention at least two. One is on the student side. As some of you may have heard me say earlier this year, this past fall, we were able to bring in a first year class thanks to the efforts of Vice Provost Jay Goff and Ben Toll. That class is the most diverse class, the most Pell student class um, that we've had in the 201-year history of this university. And that's something that we focused on. We want to make sure that we're drawing high quality students to this university first, but also a diverse student population. We think that that's also part of what we want to do as a university is provide a diverse learning environment for students coming from all over the world. And then the third piece for us is to think about affordability. We obviously want to make sure that to the extent that we can, mitigate the financial burden that we impose upon students who um, it, one of the things that keep me up at night, honestly, is our increasing tuition and the fact that we know that that burden is serious for students and many students are unable to come, particularly minority students are having difficulty making the decision to come to GW precisely because it's not affordable to them. And so we're working on that as well. The other thing I'd mention is, and the deans certainly know this, is, I speak to them frequently about the importance of putting their best efforts towards recruiting diverse faculty and diverse in all of the senses of diversity, intellectually diverse, but also ethnically, religiously, whatever it might bring in terms of enhancing the faculty contribution to university life. They need to be thinking intentionally about that and actually doing the kinds of work that will ensure that you have a robust, diverse pipeline of candidates for every faculty position that is filled at this university. When I was vice provost for faculty affairs, I wrote a memo to the then provost identifying areas of opportunity and generating and improving faculty diversity. And of course, I wrote it shortly before he left. And so I ended up more or less writing the memo to myself. Um, but the good thing is I was able to pass that on to the diversity program review team so that they understood the kinds of things that I thought the provost then should be looking to implement in order to make material changes.
The other thing I'll just offer, particularly related to students, undergrad and graduate, is that since the survey, we hired the inaugural assistant director for cultural programming and social justice education at the institution. So some of you are familiar with the program Breaking Bread and many other efforts that have been underway. We just had a social justice student retreat this weekend on the Vern. So there's a lot of programming that's happened just even in the last 6 or so months since the hire of that role. As Carolyn mentioned, and I echoed before, we also hired a graduate student who works on graduate focused efforts out of our office. And so I think that we're continuing to figure out ways to build and also ways to provide opportunities for graduate students to work in the office and then also be people who can activate on campus these programming and other efforts to draw some of those connections that we saw come up as maybe areas of disconnect in the survey. So we have just a few minutes left. I'll wrap up with just a few more questions. Abby and Aaliyah, there's a question that came in. It's a multi-part question. Did the survey include any questions about how undergraduates engaged with faculty in meaningful ways? Is it primarily in the classroom, labs, clinics? What lessons does GW derive from that in terms of investment?
So I'll go ahead and say that we stayed pretty high level in terms of climate experiences for this survey, but the Office of Survey Research and Analysis does a number of surveys of the student population pretty regularly. A lot of the information that's in this question specifically about interactions with faculty, particular types of classroom experiences, extracurricular activities, mentored research experiences, all of those are covered in the graduation survey. And the survey is required at this point in order to get tickets to commencement. And so the response rate for students is particularly high compared to what we received on this survey. And that information does exist in a dashboard that is available to all student affairs staff and faculty in their particular schools. And so that information is regularly used for program accreditation processes and student services on campus to be able to better assess their programs and make sure that students are benefiting from them.
Could you also speak, Aaliyah, to the survey that goes out typically to first and second year students, like the pulse temperature surveys?
Yes. So actually, that survey is active right
Mhm.
now. If we have any undergraduate students in the room who are first years, typically depends on the needs for that particular semester. But once a semester, we do survey undergraduate students and sometimes graduate students, depending, like I said, on the needs of the semester, to identify students who need particular support in different areas and to determine what resources they have already accessed and particularly highlight ones that they might not know about. So that's known as the check-in survey. And that is one of our most active surveys that has direct action after it. So lists of students are provided to campuses or campus offices that can help them with needs that they have identified. And I'm particularly proud of that one as being something where there's immediate action that happens after we receive that data.
Thank you. And Provost Bracy and Carolyn, these last kind of pieces are to the two of you. Could you talk to what's next? So, Carolyn, perhaps talking about the rest of the program review process, and then Provost Bracy perhaps talking about what happens when it's delivered.
Over the course of the next couple of months, we will receive a set of draft recommendations from our subcommittees, so from the faculty, staff, and student subcommittees. We'll work on trying to compile all of the recommendations from the three groups. We'll present a draft document to the provost. Once we feel like we're in a good place in terms of what that document looks like, we will be pulling together an external review team, a small group of people. We're trying to think through making a final list of who those individuals will be, but we want a mix of people who are certainly national DEI leaders, but we also want other leaders like our provost, right, who care about these issues, who've worked on them, who've made progress in their own spaces to sort of kick the tires on the recommendations that we've put together, to review kind of the results of the survey and to look at the recommendations and give us some feedback on what our team has put together. ultimately, the goal is to be able to present the recommendations, the final recommendations to our board of trustees for ultimate approval so that we can move forward with them. I don't know if you want to say more about that.
Yeah, I would just elaborate on that a little bit. Uh, we have a new president coming on board, and part of what that new president will need to do is some strategic planning. We had a strategic plan, Vision 2021, which expired in June of 2021. And we've been operating under a set of academic priorities that I established in conjunction with the efforts of the deans and the faculty to sort of tide us over until we had that new president in place and the strategic planning process could begin. And of course, the strategic planning process itself would also serve as the foundation for a capital campaign to fund whatever we agree we aspire to do as part of our strategic planning process. Um, I would like to think that diversity and inclusive excellence will be an important component of our next strategic plan. And I would love to be able to take the recommendations that come from this process and build those into the strategic plan with the support of the faculty and the academic leaders. And we operationalize what we can immediately in the short term. We strategize about what we might be able to do in the medium term. And then we go ahead and go out on the road and see if we can't do some fundraising around some of the ideas that we think deserve investment in long term. But I fully see it integrated in our overall pursuit of academic excellence as a university.
Thank you. So with that, we are just at time. I appreciate and want to just acknowledge all the folks who are writing thank you through the question in China URL. So we appreciate you. I just want to say we see that you're offering that gratitude and appreciate that. I want to thank our team, our research survey team for all the work that they have done from the start and the provost for allowing us to move forward with this effort over the past year and some change. And so thank you to each of you for your participation, for your attendance here in person and or virtually. If you would like to join us again tomorrow, we will do this all again for you. And for those who have additional questions, points of feedback, anything that you'd like to share with us, all of that information on how to do so will be available on our website. Our email address is there. So again, after you leave here today, you'll get access to the executive summary, the slides, recordings, and how to contact us if you have any points of questions, feedback, thoughts, your own ideas. And just remember, this is one part of the entire process. And so we are eager to get to those recommendations and move this work forward to create the GW we all want and deserve. And so with that, thank you and raise high.